stay. And if you stay, I can't really give you anything that nice, but we'll try to resurface your street or something like that. But you all are the future, not just of medicine, you'll hear that conversation, but I like to say in many other ways, the future of our country. The last time I was holding a microphone like this and speaking to a crowd I didn't know that well, I was on the presidential campaign trail. I had the chance to be a surrogate for the Harris-Walz ticket, the Biden-Harris ticket. And don't worry, I won't get partisan now. I'll just say everything's great. But in a lot of those conversations, you heard these silos of different sides of our country. You heard people who were scared of the other side. You heard fears, you heard concerns. You never heard the best of America. You all bring to us the best. You treat and work with everyone. You come from everywhere. You don't care about politics or background. You care about making sure that you can help not only save lives, but make people's lives more fulfilling. You are doing the work that is key for the future of all of us. So while I may not have understood your presentations today, and wisely, you didn't invite me here this morning or else I might have been lost, what you are doing for us is something that all of us in Kansas City, in Missouri and Kansas, and throughout America could stand to do more of. You're listening to others, you're learning, you're coming from different institutions, you're meeting new people, you're relying on others, and frankly, you're caring about so many other people in our community that you never knew before. So on behalf of all of us in Kansas City, I want to say a tremendous thank you. On behalf of just me personally, as someone who has now been blessed with 2 young children, so I'm learning the medical establishment in a very different way. Thank you for the work that you have chosen to do. And more than anything, I've been thinking about this all day, my remarks to you, believe it or not. And I know I'm not the keynote speaker. I will take no place of anyone else. But I also want to make sure as you go through this journey, enjoy it. And you may say, why is he saying that? So I was at law school and was in a cold, snowy place. I was really working hard each and every day. And occasionally, I didn't stop to appreciate the people around me and the work we were doing. Make sure that you get a chance to get to know everybody, not just here today, but in your programs. Know that you have to have joy as you go through this process. And know more than anything that there are a lot more people rooting for your success than you could ever imagine. I appreciate what you do for Kansas City. I love having your presence here, and I thank you for giving me a bit of time. Continue to have a wonderful time here today. If you are not a Kansas City resident, spend lots and lots of money while you're here. Before you go home, do all of that. But more than anything, thank you, and God bless you for your chosen work. You are saving lives, you're making differences, and you're inspiring all of us. Thank you so much.
Okay, so up next, I'm going to introduce the keynote speaker. So Dr. Shawn St. Peter is a prominent pediatric surgeon at Children's Mercy, serving as the Interim Chief Scientific Officer, Senior Vice President, Surgeon-in-Chief, Associate Program Director of the Pediatric Surgery Fellowship Program, and Director of the Center for Prospective Trials. He holds the Thomas Holder and Keith Ashcraft Endowed Chair of Surgical Research. Dr. St. Peter earned his undergraduate degree in zoology from the University of Idaho and his medical degree from the University of Washington. He completed his surgical residency at the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, including a research year at Oxford University and a fellowship in pediatric surgery at Children's Mercy. He's an accomplished researcher and educator, has over 400 publications, authored chapters in textbooks, and delivered numerous national and international lectures. His work focuses on improving surgical outcomes, minimizing healthcare costs, and advancing pediatric surgical care through comparative effectiveness trials. He has received multiple accolades, including the Golden Apple Mercy Mentor Award 6 times. So without further ado, I'll hand the microphone to Dr. Shawn St. Peter.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate everybody who organized this event. Go ahead, start. I'm going to come down here so I can see what you're looking at. All right, these are our committee members. acknowledgements. I won't read through all of these. Public Relations Committee, Judge Recruitment Committee, Planning Committee, AV support, and thank you to our sponsors, particularly the one on the right there. All right, award ceremony. Are we going to do that now? Are we moving over to the talk? Okay, let's go to the presentation. All right, so I was asked to give a little bit of the story of my foray into clinical research. And so we can go to the next slide. And it started in Wallace, Idaho. This is my journey into medicine. And a little town in the little strip between Montana and Washington, it's the deep snow territory, so all the precipitation gets stopped because the Continental Divide is the Idaho-Montana border, and this is about 15 minutes away from it. So growing up in this town, I was about 8th grade when I realized that I wanted to be a subspecialized surgeon in a big city. Now, if you're in North Idaho, big city means Denver or Seattle. And that was my plan B if plan A didn't work out, which was to play defensive back in the NFL. And as it turned out, Idaho fast is not California, Texas, or Florida fast. So I quickly went to plan B and went to the University of Idaho, turning all my attention to getting into medical school. We can go to the next slide. So now I knew I wanted to be a doctor, so at least I identified one point in the person of where I wanted to be. But then going down the path of getting into surgery, at the University of Idaho, I focused on doing the best I could and was fortunate to get into the University of Washington in Seattle, which is where I wanted to go. And once I got there, I got exposed to the general surgery residency program, which is pre-80-hour work week, remarkably brutal. The senior residents were toxic, to say the least. And so they had instilled in me that you don't want to be an academician because they lived in such a toxic environment, they didn't want to be like their attendings. So they said, you should consider being a physician, not a politician. And that resonated with me. So I was like, that's it, I'm gonna be a clinician. And then I ended up matching at the Mayo Scottsdale because it seemed like most of the academic machines seem to say, well, put you on the conveyor belt, and then you come off on this end and take your boards. There, they seem to say, we will mentor you in the art of surgery. So I wanted to go there, and when I matched there, the University of Washington, they feel like if you step off their curb, you fall into academic abyss and you'll never be heard from again. So I was told you could never get into a competitive fellowship. And I wanted to do transplant or cardiac, and there's plenty of those fellowships to go around. So I drove off to residency, next slide. And the only two things I had ruled out was academics and pediatric surgery. So how did I end up becoming an academic pediatric surgeon? Next slide. It started my first year. I was in the ICU, and my senior resident was interviewing for pediatric surgery. And he met me like 9 o'clock at night in the ICU. We had 14 people in the vascular service. And he was grilling me on a bunch of things. And he said, you know, you should consider pediatric surgery. And I was like, no, you have to take time off. It's super competitive. And he said, why would you be in a hurry to finish when you're going to do the same job for the rest of your life? Okay, fair enough. This is wintertime. Appsites are about to happen. So I said, if I do really well on the appsites, then I'll scrap my plastics rotation in April and go downtown and do peds. So I went downtown and did peds, and that changed everything. When you round in the NICU, those aren't patients, those are souls. These patients acquire disease to no fault of their own. They get better. Once I got exposed to pediatric surgery, then there wasn't a plan B. I had to do that. So being the competitive fellowship it is, it requires doing research. So I took the time off and I went to Oxford, next slide, and got exposed to research. Once I got back, I was completely engaged in clinical research. I was biting at the ankles of all of my attendees asking for some project to work on. And each time you finish one, then you get better at it. And so once I got to the point that I matched in pediatric surgery, research started as a means to an end, which was to get what I wanted, which is pediatric surgery. By the time I got there, it had become a means to a means, which was to answer questions, and then it got fun. And so when you're doing research, that's where it needs to come from. If you're doing it to get an endowed chair or to become full professor, then you have to ask if that's what you should be doing. Because research should be about answering questions, and that should be what fills your cup. Next question. So the landscape in pediatric surgery, that last slide showed the levels of evidence, highest of which is randomized trials. But the landscape of pediatric surgery is that we're just a few generations removed from the people who started the field. And those few training centers end up affecting the opinions of masses. So there's lots of dogma in our field that starts from Boston Children's when Bob Gross started the first training program. Next slide. After I mastered ped surg, one of my attendings who I respected a lot said, we could never do randomized trials in pediatric surgery because parents would never consent and surgeons would never have equipoise. To the first, I say, let's ask and accept whatever rates you're going to get for enrollment, but the second deserves some exploration. Next slide. Equipoise is the condition in which a physician is truly indifferent between the therapeutic value of an experimental versus a control. That sounds great, but when that term was introduced, it was introduced as the basis for randomized trials, that the participants of a randomized trial must have equipoise in order to create a fair comparison of two different treatment methods. But it was quickly recognized that personal equipoise is overwhelmingly fragile. We are conclusion-making machines, and you give us the slightest amount of evidence and we'll quickly come to a conclusion as to which one is superior. And that's why we all have a practice pattern, because we have a preference for doing things. And then once something happens that affects that one way or the other, it upsets the equipoise, and then we have a new practice pattern. So how can we conduct a study of personal equipoise is impossible? The answer is with clinical equipoise. So if there's no proof of superiority and there's justification to support both arms, I don't think you need equipoise to be any part of a trial, including designing one. Next slide. So I'll give an extreme example here. Next slide. When I was a fellow, there was a paper that said, don't start with a chest tube if you have empyema. That's when you got pus in the chest. You can go straight to the operating room and debride it, but don't put in a chest tube and wait. There was another paper that said, go straight to fibrinolysis. So put in a catheter and start the TPA, but don't put in a tube and wait. So depending on which paper, you're good, next slide. So depending on which paper the referring service had read, they would either be sent straight to IR or straight to surgery. So we were treating patients in two independent pathways in our hospital in real time based on conflicting evidence, but no one had compared the two. So our radiologist there thought that fibrinolysis was just as good. We knew that VATS was better. Why do I say that? Not just because it seemed intuitive, but because we looked at the data, and our patients got out of the hospital 2.5 days earlier than the patients who got treated with fibrinolysis. So why would we do a study? Why wouldn't we just declare superiority? Because on the surgery service, we pull chest tubes on a 24-hour clock, and we discharge patients on a 24-hour clock. So it's not impossible for someone to get a chest tube removed at 3 in the morning and get discharged at 6 in the morning. If they're on the ped service and radiology is consulting, then you go into the weekend and neither is going to happen until Monday. So maybe that could be a factor. Either way, we felt like we needed to do the academic exercise to prove our assumption that VATS is the way to treat these patients. Next slide. So we enrolled these patients because if we can both agree that there is no comparative data and we design the trial such that we can impact the outcome because we're fixed on how we manage them. When we first submitted this to the IRB, it got turned down. And there was some scientific concerns that they had. But independently, the argument back to the IRB is, if they're being treated both ways anyway in our hospital, we have an ethical obligation to do this study so that we have the comparative data with which we can consult families in the future, so that we can tell them what the relative difference is between these two, because right now we can't. Next slide. So we're enrolling patients that have this in their pleural space. So you can imagine why we, the surgeons, thought it was incredulous that you could try to treat this with medication. When we're pulling this out of the chest, it's a gratifying operation. And in the fibrinolysis arm, they got a 12 French tube and 3 rounds of TPA. That was just standard debridement. Next slide. And we were pretty close to finishing when London at the Great Ormond Street published their study. And they had 60 patients in, this was eerie, because we were just entering the clinicaltrials.gov era and looking at their protocol. You could overlap it with ours and it was identical, except they used urokinase instead of TPA. There was no collaboration, we hadn't discussed this. When their paper came out, they found there was no difference in length of stay, and that was the primary outcome we were both looking for. Otherwise, there was no difference except for VATS was more expensive in 1 and 6, and the fibrinolysis arm ended up going on to VATS. What we found was that there was no difference in consultation. Next. And in the outcomes, we found the exact same thing London did. So there was no advantage to VATS, fibrinolysis less costly, but once an operation, once not. So when I presented this at APSA, American Pediatric Surgery Association, I said I stand here with clinical humility, but scientific confidence that we should be probably treating these patients with fibrinolysis. Telling surgeons that surgery is not better didn't go well, and it continues to not go well. So this was the protocol that came out of that trial, and then you do your 3 rounds. If you're still not having improvement, then repeat imaging, and then if you have persistent disease, go to VATS. So these guys are happy because they were right, and we're happy because we feel like we're treating our patients in an informed manner. One of the criticisms was that the study was too small. Agree. 18 observations is not enough. So we continued the fibrinolysis protocol exactly as outlined in the trial for the next 100 consecutive patients, and the results were the same. So then we got to the point where people are saying, but you have this 1 in 6 failure rate. And we realized it's because we were still hanging on to what we used for the protocol. If you're going to do a randomized trial, you have to have very strict definitions as to who fails. So if you still had a fever after 4 days, then you went on and got imaging. But then we asked ourselves the question, who cares if they have a fever? Because they've got parenchymal disease. This is a parapneumonic effusion by definition. You've got a pneumonia. Sometimes necrosis, sometimes dead areas of lung. So can they eat? Are they off oxygen? In which case, get to oral antibiotics and go home. And then once we no longer handcuffed ourselves to that, you had to continue to be sick, not be able to get off oxygen, not be able to eat well, and then we would repeat imaging and look for pleural space disease. And go ahead and go back one more, sorry. When we defined it that way, only 2 patients failed in the more contemporary, but we haven't had a single case of that since 2016. So I started this journey in order to prove that VATS was the way to treat these patients, and as a result of the work, I'm never going to do that operation again. And this is how we treat them now. Next slide. So another example of establishing equipoise, I've joked, it used to be a joke, now it's not. If you have at least 2 people in a practice, then you've got equipoise because you're going to have something, NG tubes, Foley's, pre-op antibiotics, that they disagree on. And so the extreme example in surgery is, should we be irrigating? And some people believe that dilution is the solution to pollution, so just get as much saline in there as possible. And other people believe that macrophages don't swim. And maybe if you're irrigating, you're just spreading contamination to unprepared portions of the peritoneal cavity. So this is something that gets debated at every M&M. There's always surgeons on both sides. So we included patients under age 18 who had either a hole in the appendix or a fecalith in the abdomen. Now, what came out of this trial, this may be one of the most important things, because prior to this, people weren't defining perforation other than it looks bad. And so we didn't have any way to control the denominator of perforated appendicitis. Since then, all of the studies that have been done use this strict definition. Next one. You had a 1 liter bag, you had to use at least 500 cc's. Pretty much most people just use the liter. And then suction only used the same suction irrigator because we wanted a control for the quality of suction, not the exact same one, that would be gross, but the same model, next one, and that's it. They were all managed the same post-operatively. There was no difference in presentation. And what we found is that almost everybody got the full liter, nobody crossed over, and after 100 years of arguing this, there was no difference. So of almost any study I've done, I think this may be the most equivalent, that if you looked at these as ping pong balls, irrigation, no irrigation, you can throw them back in the machine and keep pulling them out, and you're never gonna find a difference because the delta just doesn't exist. There was no difference in temperature curves. There was, in the patients who got a drain, there was no difference in days of drainage, days of stay, time to diet, days of home health, charges, and you see these numbers are identical. Even the distribution of abscesses was the exact same. So, after 100 years of arguing about it, irrigation and suction alone are the same. And now, people in both camps can settle down a little bit, but also neither are wrong. Next slide. So just going to touch on this really quickly because I got the galley proofs yesterday, which means this is going to be coming out in the Lancet probably in the next couple weeks, and we're going to be releasing some media about it. So what is the API trial? This is some next level stuff, and what I mean by that is in the pursuit of minimally invasive surgery, which is where I started my career, wanting to do more big cases laparoscopically, then do those cases with fewer ports, smaller instruments, and keep moving down that path of making the burden of treatment as little as possible for these conditions. The ultimate minimally invasive surgery is one that never happened. So collaborating with 11 centers around the world, next slide, we designed a pragmatic, parallel, unmasked, non-inferiority study with close to 1,000 patients. Next slide. And we are comparing antibiotics alone to appendectomy. Not antibiotics and then follow-up appendectomy, but antibiotics, let's let it ride. Go ahead back to the previous slide. So we define treatment failure. Now, you're not going to have a recurrence of appendicitis after you take it out. So we couldn't just look at recurrence when recurrence is the main problem with antibiotics. How many people get their appendix out within a year? So we included negative appendectomy in the failure rate because that's somebody who, had you not operated on, would have been fine with or without antibiotics. So in that, can't show the data because it hasn't been published yet, but what we found was a 1/3 failure rate at 1 year. So 1/3 of the patients who got the antibiotics got an appendectomy at 1 year. 7% of the patients had a negative appendectomy. That delta is 26%. The non-inferiority margin was 20. So we do declare antibiotics inferior. But as we're doing this trial, I didn't really care about arguing over inferiority versus non-inferiority. We'll let the trialists continue to debate that. Now mom has a number. So if you're scared of an operation, take the antibiotics. You got a 2/3 chance of not getting an appendectomy. You got a state wrestling match tomorrow, take the antibiotics. It's kind of like having just an upset stomach for a day if you take the antibiotics because by tomorrow the pain's mostly gone and you have no somatic injury. So all of the examples I gave are comparing A versus B. That's very easy to do. But how can we investigate when you have new therapies? Really important question to ask in the interventional worlds, because how many amazing interventions have we done that just came on an idea? And what if we're wrong? So the way this typically works is that somebody comes up with an idea, and then they describe it, and then they do some of these cases, and then you start to have some comparative studies. And then ultimately you go to randomized trials. That's how medications are introduced. That's how many procedures are introduced. But, next slide, you can't do that in every circumstance. Laparoscopy, we went from a laparotomy, where you're making a big incision to take out a gallbladder, take out a kidney, take out a spleen, wrap the stomach around the bottom of the esophagus. Those are big incisions, big exposures, lots of retractors. We went to doing it laparoscopically, where we could just do this without even making a laparotomy. So in these examples, these are disruptive innovations. We don't need a randomized trial to say that the device in your pocket is superior to the 29 devices it replaces. That's a disruptive innovation. In those cases, somebody has an idea, then they go ahead and try it, and then they do several, and then it jumps to standard of care. And that's what happened with lap choles. That's what happened with lap spleens. After people had done a few, they started declaring it malpractice if you're opening a patient to take care of the same problem. Everybody got on board. Next. So the problem with that is, what if we're wrong? Next slide. Subconscious malfeasance. It's not that. Next slide. It's that. So this is the frontal lobotomy. The inventor of this was awarded the Nobel Prize. This was a common way to treat mental illness in the 1940s. Imagine today using penetrating frontal brain trauma to treat mental pain. Next. Many examples of this. The arterial bypass for stroke, after 1,000 cases had been done, there was a randomized trial that showed no benefit. The most extreme example that I've come across is arthroscopic debridement for osteoarthritis. After a case series, it was one of the most popular operations ever performed in the United States. Over $500,000 a year. Then a subsequent randomized trial done 20 years after the introduction of this treatment, after millions of patients had an intervention under general anesthesia, there was no benefit. Colectomies for epilepsy, that sounds like a joke. The ankle chick ring, at the Mayo Clinic, they put Dr. or Mr. on there, so you call your patient doctor. And so I saw a chart that said, Dr. Ankle Chick. So I walked in and I said, "Are you the famous Dr. Ankle Chick?" And he puts his head down and goes, "Now infamous." Because it was a ring for GERD, and putting a foreign body in that location that's tight enough to have an impact ends up eroding through. And if you erode through the distal esophagus, you've now created a problem that's way worse than what you started with. Reimplants for low-grade reflux, we never do that anymore. Organectomies for trauma, almost never. The jejunal-ileal bypass for obesity and the Swan-Ganz catheter, that's one of my favorites, is that when I was a second-year resident, everybody in the ICU had a Swan-Ganz. Now, in Mayo Scottsdale, that's justifiable because they're all 84 years old and they have heart failure. But on the trauma unit, we would have a 19-year-old gunshot wound, and we'd be floating a Swan-Ganz catheter so that we could measure the differential pressures between the right and left heart. Sounds awesome, gives you lots of great numbers, but it wasn't until millions of patients had been treated with the Swan-Ganz that we had metadata on a national level to say, even if you control for the degree of illness, the mortality is worse if a patient got a Swan-Ganz, because blowing up a balloon in the pulmonary artery turns out to not be a great way to get vitals. So how do we prevent from doing the same thing again? My answer is investigate with new treatments. When new treatments arise, either do a prospective observational study with careful investigation, or if it's close enough, then do a comparative study. So pectus excavatum is the most painful thing that we do to children. And their chest is caved in, so we put a bar in that makes it straight. The problem is the pressure. It's like putting on braces and then tightening them to gold the day you put them on, instead of doing it slowly over 3 years. So once they wake up, the pressure is just overwhelming. And the patients, we studied these patients for a decade. We did epidural versus PCA, we did a randomized trial, 110 patients, couldn't find a difference between the two. 4.2 versus 4.5 days in the hospital. And we followed up at their 3-year mark, and we asked them about how many times they think about it. They qualify for PTSD from having this operation. So we started freezing the nerves 4 through 7 before we put the bar in. And the first patient that I did this on in 2016 gets up the next morning, takes a shower, puts on his shirt, and goes home. And how do you compare that? You can't. At that point, literally one patient had been treated, and you start to think, it's now malpractice to not do this. We were a little ahead of the curve, but when we presented our 9-patient series in 2018 in Seattle, it said that the average length of stay was 1 day. There was an audible gasp. And then the emails started flooding. People came to visit, started watching this operation. And we were getting patients for a while from everywhere. And now I think people would consider a contraindication to cryotherapy a contraindication to doing the operation. We were 30 patients into the second randomized trial, comparing epidural to PCA. So we added more bells and whistles to both arms, and then we started doing the cryo. So we paused that trial, did a prospective observational study of our first 35 patients, and compared them, and there was no comparison. So I'll finish by kind of addressing some of the things that we learned through this Center for Prospective Trials and my personal journey in going through clinical research. It struck me when I was young not to put too much emphasis on the naysayers. And it started as an idea that you can order your mice from a lab catalog with the same genotype. You can't order your patients the same way. So accept whatever clinical limitations you have, accept the heterogeneity. You can use mathematical models to address it, but move on and try to answer the question. Because if you spend forever trying to make it perfect, then you'll end up not doing much. So I started to think more about that thought. And a naysayer isn't somebody who criticizes a study, but it's any person or personality that leads to an obstruction. And the most important naysayer of all is ourselves. Everybody here has had the experience that you have an audacious goal, that you want to get an advanced degree, you want to apply for a grant, you want to reach a new level of fitness, you want to accomplish something. And then as time goes by, you think back when I had that idea, if I would have started then, I would be done by now. I would have accomplished it. But just didn't get going. And why is that? Why do we limit ourselves? Typically, the linchpin is because we're afraid to fail. And you guys don't get to hear this very often, but failure is okay. And it's actually sometimes a good thing, because we're all going to learn more from our failures than we will our successes. And once you become a practicing clinician, you will know painfully what I'm talking about. That it's going to be those bad outcomes that teach you the most. It's not going to be the ones that you did well, because you don't know if you got away with it or if you did the right thing. So embrace failure. Go into that room, turn on that light, and see what you find. Because you know what you're going to find? Nothing. The clock keeps ticking. The sun comes up tomorrow. The other 7 billion people on the planet don't care. They get failed. And so the last point, maybe the most important, which is a theme that you heard from this presentation, that as you evolve, then you can't take that position that you currently have as anything more than its own iteration. That's not the end point. We have to keep growing. Once conviction replaces curiosity, then your growth stops. So right now you'll have these young, beautiful, malleable minds, and you're going to start to take strong positions. Always question those, no matter how strongly you feel about a political issue, a person. Approach it with curiosity, and sometimes you end up shifting your position. This is rarely better depicted than in the movie Men in Black. So Will Smith is a young Agent J, and you see Agent K there talking to him. And he's just shown Agent J the aliens for the first time. So Men in Black, they police and monitor alien activity on planet Earth. So after showing him the aliens, he's mind blown. And he says, 1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was flat. 15 minutes ago, you knew that humans are alone on this planet. So just imagine what you'll know tomorrow. Next slide. I'd be happy to take any questions. Sir?
I have a question regarding the AFI trial.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
For the patients that were negative for their insights when the surgeons went in, was it a clinical diagnosis that it was a negative for AFI, or how were they thinking of this?
That was a pathologic diagnosis of a negative appendectomy because it can be a difficult call in that sometimes it looks a little punctate, but then they say there's no inflammation. Sometimes it looks like there's no inflammation and they say that there's pinworms, which you did a therapeutic operation.
So how did you account for those patients as far as like return with AFI? Because obviously they got taken out.
So you're saying the patients that return and get an appendectomy,
Yeah.
and what about them?
In comparison to patients who were antibiotic only and then returned.
Was there a difference in the patients who failed versus the patients who succeeded with it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was. And we aren't able to do subset analysis in the first trial. We just report the primary outcomes, even though some reviewers asked for it. They should know that you follow the protocol that you already published. But just the same, that will be subsequent secondary analysis. But the spoiler is that a fecalith in the appendix almost doubles your rate of failure. So it's 48-50% failure rate in those that had a fecalith. Everything else was not predictive. White count, age, gender, obesity, you name it. They're all pretty much equivalent. So if there's a stone in the appendix, then don't offer antibiotics.
Yeah, wonderful talk, thank you. So for some of those trials, there was sort of a 20-year time between initiation of a procedure and then validation that, there wasn't really any difference or it wasn't effective. So I'm a PhD also, so not a clinician. So I was sort of shocked by that, because I thought, don't clinicians follow up? How come they did not know that their procedure was not making any difference to outcome for the patient?
Because there was not a comparative arm at the same time. So once people started doing the arthroscopic debridement for osteoarthritis, they weren't also having a control group that wasn't getting treatment. They were just offering the operation. Well, you've got pain in your knee, let me do that for you. Right now, we've got this debate with biliary dyskinesia, people who have a dysfunctional gallbladder. And then we take it out, and 2/3 of the patients get better, but a third don't, and their pattern of symptoms doesn't change. Simultaneously, we're not offering observation. So we're not saying, you've got biliary dyskinesia, your two choices are observation versus surgery. We're just doing surgery. And so we may be kicking ourselves in a decade or two if we identify some variable that says these patients don't need an operation.
So were the surgeons, I mean, for the osteoarthritis, in follow-up, was it that you assumed that patients would improve, but ultimately they all, basically that their osteoarthritis got worse? Why would you not notice that there was no difference? Even if you're not comparing, I mean, you're doing a procedure, you're assuming it's going to help in some way, so there must have been some benefit otherwise.
So one of the flaws in surgical research, period, is long-term follow-up. Short-term follow-up in orthopedics is super messy. And anybody here who's had an orthopedic operation knows that, because you get a lot worse for quite a while before you start to feel better. And so you've got a broken foot, kind of hurts, take some graft from your ankle, put a couple screws in it, and it hurts a lot worse for the next 6 months. You got to spend 6 weeks in a cast and 6 months in a walking boot, personal experience. and then after a year you still can't wear a tight shoe and you're wondering if you would have been better off with the fracture that you had before. With osteoarthritis, they have pain in their knees. You know it's going to get a lot worse. On the outside, they start to feel a little bit better. Are they feeling better than they did de novo, or are they feeling better after their inflammatory insult that came from the operation? So there was enough there to lead people to think that they were doing some good. Having said that, a friend of mine had a rotator cuff tear after a mountain bike race went over a log. And he couldn't hold his shoulder up, so if he relaxes, his shoulder falls like this. So he went ahead and had the operation. It was a year-long recovery. He couldn't do a push-up for a year. And now, when he's at the pool, if he relaxes his arm, it goes like this. And he says he wished he hadn't done that. But still, I think if you went to most orthopods now with a torn rotator cuff, they'll recommend surgery.
Eric Corbell from University. What characteristics of bodies you look for in medical students and residents that you work with in pediatric surgery?
That is a fantastic question. So both applying for surgery and pediatric surgery, of course, the price of admission are those people who test extremely well and have shown cognitive abilities that are in the upper echelon. We don't want to bring on somebody who is a board risk, and those people who have always lived at the top are not a risk. They're going to pass their tests. Also, they have the ability to manage it. The reason that the CV counts, and when I was resident, I was in the lab in the middle of the night thinking, how does this help programs understand that I've got an ability to manage all personality types above and below, even when I'm incredibly fatigued, and to be able to make difficult decisions and keep things straight in your head, and all the things that are important for being a fellow. And the answer is it doesn't. It just measures want, because we all know what the application is about. So those people who have an application that's put together, that gets you to the interview phase. Once you get there, what we really want is someone who's teachable, somebody who's coachable, somebody that you'll enjoy being at the OR table with for 2 years. And that then separates those people, because there was 2 years in a row that we got the single top person in the match, that everybody agreed this is the top person. It was the worst year when those two were together, because these two alphas could not work together. Neither one of them were fun to operate with or to teach. At one point I told one of them, one of the two of us has to be here to finish this operation. So either, I didn't have to say anything else after that. He got the point that either you're going to do what I say, or you can excuse yourself and I'll finish this case. That's not the person you're looking for. You're looking for the person that's there to learn how to do it. Not to tell you what they did during residency, but to learn the way that you're doing it so that they have as many arrows in their quiver as possible and are pleasant in the process. And as far as managing teams, both up and down, managing difficult personalities, that also is a very special trait, because when you go to the NICU and you're taking care of those patients, those teams and nurses are very protective, and you go in there as a stranger and you are not welcome. And so you have to embrace that, and you have to earn their trust. Same thing in the PICU, same thing on the floor, more so than you'll find in the adult hospitals.
Couple of symptoms, UKC. You mentioned the non-operative approach to situations that we used to operate on, for example, splenectomy. Of course, but there are some spleens that you will operate on. I remember taking one out, someone, he had angiography, and they embolized it. When he got to the ward, his pressure went way down, so I got him there and had him and just took care of him. 8-year-old kid, pretty straightforward. But what about appendicitis? Are there some cases of appendicitis, perforated appendicitis, that I stopped doing surgery before we got to the point where we weren't operating on appendicitis. So are there cases that you are going to operate on when it's perforated appendicitis?
Okay, that's a really good question, because now you can manage non-perforated appendicitis with antibiotics, you can manage perforated appendicitis with antibiotics. But the debate around a patient with perforated appendicitis, do they do better with an early operation or interval appendectomy, so antibiotics and take it out in 6 weeks? There was a randomized trial done in Nashville. My friend Marty Blakely took all comers with perforated appendicitis, and there was a substantial advantage to early operation. But he didn't separate those that showed up with a well-formed abscess. We did a randomized trial comparing those that had a well-formed abscess that radiology agreed they could place a drain in. That's how you got into the study. And you either went to this OR for appendectomy or you got a drain placed. There was no difference in total length of stay, but we measured the quality of life. And the quality of life in the patients who kept their appendix for an extra 6 to 12 weeks stayed stressed for an additional 6 to 12 weeks. So the mental burden on the families were higher in those who didn't get the early operation, because you get the diagnosis, just go ahead and get sick, get the operation, spend 5 days in the hospital and be done with it, as opposed to spend 3 or 4 days in the hospital, go home, deal with the risk of recurrence, not feeling well the whole time, come back and get the operation. So currently we favor doing an early operation on almost everybody with perforated appendicitis, with the exception of the patient who is already unable to make better. So if they come in eating cheeseburgers and you find an abscess, then just go ahead and place a drain, because you're not going to make them better.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry.
Okay, Henrietta from KU.
Hi, Henrietta.
I'm curious, like, what advice you have for like students that are engaged in research, especially those that are like aiming for competitive specialties, and like how to not lose sight of, you know, big goal and not get caught up in the numbers, because I know that's what like recruiters sometimes care about, like, you know, how publications and presentations you have. So sometimes it can be tough to like balance those two.
That is a tough balance. So now being on the other side of that wall, I can talk about the passion of answering questions. But I didn't start there. I had to start with the pragmatic position of anything that's low yield that I can get to publication relatively simply and quickly is something that's worth taking on. I had an attending say, a case report's not worth it. It's not worth it if you're going to spend 1.5 years working on it. It's worth it if you can turn it over in 2 days and get it submitted. And if you do that each year of your residency, that's an additional 5 publications. And there are those studies that if you take a look at a retrospective data set and you can see that you're going to be able to spin off 2 or 3 things out of this once you collect that data, then go for it. If you see that something's going to take 1.5 years to get through the research project and you may or may not see anything out of it, those are the kind of risks you can take later, but you do have to be a little bit more pragmatic. And in our research fellowship, we have 3 research fellows. These are people who want to do pediatric surgery. They'll come out during their residency or after their residency, and they're doing research with us. We specifically protect them from things like that. So we wouldn't engage them in the API trial that went from concept in 2014 to getting published in 2 weeks. They're going to be working on things that they can present and publish during their year or 2.
It's a very related question. So with step 1 for medical students going to pass-fail right now, a lot of students see that research is a way that's going to make them stand out. And for applying for residency, there's different types of research that you can do. And as you mentioned, you do a case report, you can get something out really quickly. So could you comment a little bit on the value of different types? So for example, students can present a lot of posters doing, very small analyses, right? And so you can get 20 posters out on one data set by just looking at, let's look at sex, let's look at race, let's look at urban versus social, let's look at a few things and just get poster after poster abstract out versus, doing a more, what would you say, quantity versus quality. So versus doing a study that may take longer but will get you a publication. So what is your thoughts on, the distribution? Obviously it's easier for students starting off to get a poster and a presentation on the meeting. What are your thoughts on that?
Both. So we can read a CV, you can as well, and you're going to be able to look at those people who have 8 papers in high impact journals and they're not at all related to each other, versus somebody who's got 12 papers in a 6-month span in Journal of Surgical Research where they just slice that salami 12 times and presented them all at the Academic Surgical Congress, which is a congress that is designed to build academic careers such that if a med student submits to the Academic Surgical Congress, it will not be rejected. So a way to get an abstract on at the ASC is to just make your med student first author, and it's going to get presented. So when we see that, then we know that that person is in a clever, productive environment. As far as the type of research, there's a home for you anywhere. So if you are an excellent clinical researcher during your residency, you're going to get favor at Children's Mercy. If you spent 3 years in the basic science lab with Brad Warner in St. Louis, you're going to get favor at Boston and Philadelphia.
Cameron, UMKC. I'm wondering, for those that are doing research and find that they have to reject the alternate hypothesis or accept the null, and they feel less validated about that, or that is less rewarding, what do you have to say to that?
Negative. You saw, pun intended, you saw how excited I was to talk about the negative result we found with the VATS trial when that was just a slam dunk. I mean, breakaway layup, no one around us, there's just no way that this isn't going to show a substantial difference. I mean, 2.5 days, that's a huge delta. If you can save 2.5 days in the hospital for any condition, that is an, oh my God, open your eyes, get this out there because this is going to change people's lives. And that difference went away when we did this. When we did the trial and we controlled the way those patients were managed, then that difference went away. And while it was shocking, it then subsequently became exciting, and it became an adventure that I did for the next 10 years, which was to try to get more people to implement this because those patients, they do better.
What would you say is the threshold for publications using into specialties like general surgery or pediatric surgery right now?
The threshold for what?
Publications.
Oh, so for general surgery coming out of medical school, just do well in medical school. I know that people are talking about trying to get involved in research and differentiating yourself by getting a couple papers, but honestly, at the resident level, they're going to be able to see that you are able to be in a productive environment. You're typically not going to be taking your own primary ideas and then seeing them through to publication. If you did that, that would be amazing, and you would want to highlight that in your interview, that this was actually something that you wanted to see through. But once you start residency, then that's when you need to get engaged in clinical research. You want to be that person that you're attending things up first when somebody invites them to write a textbook chapter, because that's the get it done person. Because they get these abstracts done, they get the papers done. And so you're the person that they reach out to and say, hey, why don't you write this book chapter? And we all know those are the people who end up with the longer CVs because they're the can do and will do people. And then you can apply for any fellowship. And what I would say, and I'd say this to anybody all along, is when you're an undergrad, try to put yourself in a position to get into med school anywhere, so it's your choice. And then when you're in med school, try to put yourself in a position to get into any residency, so that also is your choice, and as opposed to being theirs. And then the same thing, if you don't want to be a pediatric surgeon, great, but have a CV that you could be. And then cardiac, transplant, whatever else you want to do, you'll be at the top of the pool. I met a guy when I was a third-year med student, very impressive. He was a categorical plastics fellow, and the categorical plastics had just started, which meant there was like 3 programs in the country. So instead of doing 5 years of general surgery and applying for plastics, you did 3 years of general, 3 years of plastics. And he was from Canada, and he was a third-year general surgery resident. And I said, that's pretty competitive. And he smiled and he goes, there's always room at the top. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful metaphor, that if you're not in their elbows with everybody else, but you push yourself out in front, then don't be afraid to lead the peloton.
Hi, Uma Pillai from UMKC. So my tech research today was on infective endocarditis, and one of the narratives that we keep coming across is that it's too risky to conduct a prospective trial because of the high morbidity and mortality associated with IE. Do you agree with this school of thought, or do you think there are any situations in which the risk is worth the knowledge?
That is a really tough one, because of so many things that we've been able to do that seemed absurd until that risk was taken. So, great example is carotid endarterectomy, that you have occluded carotid, so you got a risk of stroke, and you have to get that out. You've got to clean that up. And then somebody got bold enough to say, let's just treat him with aspirin. Let's just see how that goes. And after thousands of patients have been treated, we started to find there's just a very narrow segment of patients who benefit from an endarterectomy. So they've got to have a high-grade stenosis, and the surgeon who does the operation has to have less than a 5% stroke rate, and that means they're very high volume. So not just that you meet that narrow window, but you're at the right place being taken care of. Is there even an advantage to an operation that prior to somebody trying that, everybody got the operation? Even if it's a general surgeon in the community, they're going to be doing an endarterectomy if you've got a nearly occluded carotid. So not knowing the risk exactly in that particular scenario you gave is just one that you have to think carefully about, and if not, then think about how you study it in a non-comparative way.
What's the road to finding like practice-changing research to implementing it and having people follow through with the new work?
Yeah. If it makes it easier for the provider, then you're going to have it implemented. So for years, there was almost no dent in the patients getting primary VATS for empyema. And I think the surgeons can cynically say, well, it costs less, but the pharmacist gets the fees as opposed to the surgeon getting the fees. And if there's no difference in outcomes, then I'm going to do the operation. That's kind of cynical, but there's some truth to it. Total tangent, but I think 100 years from now, people will look back at this era as being somewhat criminal, that physicians were rewarded for doing things to patients. So that the more you do and the more invasive things you do, the higher the reimbursement because the higher the RVUs that come with it. And that's, you can see the natural conflict of interest there. But true story is when we did pectus excavatum surgeries, and you take out these cartilages, and then you put a little bar in, and you have to lift up pectus flaps, and it's a 3-hour operation, it's a back-breaking operation. And then Don Nuss puts in a bar, slips it in this side, comes out this side, and it just sits behind the sternum, and it pops it out. You don't have to take out all the cartilages, and so you could do this operation in an hour, you get the same result, and it's cosmetically way better. Almost universal uptake, like within 2 years of his presentation at APSA, the open operation had gone away. Same thing happened with cryotherapy. After we presented a retrospective case series, now you can't go to a meeting where people aren't showing their 200-300 patient results and their 3-year follow-up and on and on and on. It's ripe fruit academically, but everybody went to cryotherapy because it went from a painful 4 days in the hospital for both the provider and the patient to going home the next morning or going home the same day. And so the implementation was immediate. But those things that are less convenient, maybe not to the financial advantage of the surgeon, the uptake is going to be a lot less. But there is no way to force it. I mean, I used to say, I don't care. My job is to generate the evidence. Your job is to interpret it. So it's out there. If you want to practice it, fine. If not, fine. I'm not going to take it personal. Then I brought on Tolu Oyetunji and gave him our surgical research program. When I started to become chair, I realized within a year or two I'm not going to be able to continue to run this research program. Tolu was going to be leaving his institution, and you got to get the right people on the bus. So he was exactly what we needed, because we didn't need another comparative effectiveness researcher. We needed a database or basic science. He's a database researcher. And so even though it wasn't the right time, it was a year before I was going to be chair, get the right person at the wrong time, brought Tolu on, gave him the research program, and he taught me, it's okay, let's push it out there. You won't do it, I will. So we're going to generate these studies, but LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, get the stories out there, let people know, get in their ear, start the debate, and he's not afraid to just put that out there and then let people poke holes in it. But he'd rather have people having the conversation about the fact that you shouldn't be given antibiotics for pyloromyalgia than not talking about it. So I don't need to tell you guys the power of social media, but go ahead and push your ideas out there if you believe in them. Because no matter how much criticism you take, it's better that people are talking about it if you care about it.
I had a question related to the fact that the residency match process has changed with this idea that things are supposed to be more holistic now, getting rid more like a monster approach with pulling keywords out of a bin rather than having the opportunity to interview students and do it the way that you've always done it. To what extent have you had to change your interview processes, and to what extent has the pass-fail influenced how you value things? I mean, my understanding is that a letter of recommendation from a clinician in the field that's known by the residency program director is still invaluable, and that demonstration of commitment to the profession is invaluable. But now there are things that ties to the area, other things that historically were not paid as much attention to are now being looked at more rigorously. So have you had any experience with that?
We have, because by definition, being in Kansas City, and there's a lot of folks that will have done everything at Penn or everything at Boston or everything at UCSF. You recognize that those are people who are unlikely going to be wanting to move away from those areas. It's not supposed to influence your rank list. You're supposed to just say best at the top, moving on down. You know, there's zero chance that they're gonna rank you equally high. In the conversations, it always ends up having a little bit of an influence. Is this person a fit? Would they want to be in this community? Would they work well in this community? And those are things that shouldn't be entirely ignored, because having somebody come to an environment where they're going to feel happy and accepted is important. That we hopefully can create an environment that everybody is that, but that's not always the case. We hired an ophthalmologist who had done everything at Penn, and after about 9 months, this just was not a satisfying community for her, and so she left and went back to Philadelphia. These are all subtle shades in the conversation. They're not big parameters. So I would just say, do really well in all the objectives, and then when you go interview, demonstrate an authentic self that is committed to doing the training.
I was just going to follow up on that. A clinician colleague said years ago the most important part was how fun they were to have a beer with in the bar afterwards.
And for us, that's the operating room. I mean, for us, that's our fun place. And if people can keep it fun, that's great. And if they make it not fun, then you don't want them to be your fellow.
The other thing had to do with all the online interviews during the pandemic and stuff, and people feeling like they weren't necessarily being able to gauge how well a person fit with them. Did you have any bad experiences with that?
Still do. So we haven't gone back yet. So COVID solved a couple of uncrackable nuts for us. The two biggest problems that we had at Children's Mercy, I mean, absolutely unsolvable, were parking and office space. And now we have 2,500 employees who work off-site, and we've released 2 of our leases at Crown Center, where we had all the buildings that go up the side of the street. Those are all Children's Mercy buildings. Those are all Children's Mercy offices. HR, finance, all those folks fill up those buildings. And we've actually let some of those leases go. Another one was pediatric surgery. Once it grew to where there's 40 programs in the country, there's just too many to go interview at all the spots. And so it was very difficult as to figure out how do we work this out. And after we came through COVID, it was solved. We don't have to force people to travel to 30 different cities during their 4th year of residency, which is near impossibility. Now they can literally go break after a case and go interview in Milwaukee and then come back and finish their call that night. But it is painful, it is difficult, and people show up and you're just like, that's not what I saw on screen. It is very, very difficult. the term used.
Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. Yeah. I think we're gonna move on to awards now. So can we give it up for Dr. St. Peter one more time, please?
All right, so to begin, we will start with translational sciences. We'll start in third place and go to the top. So in third place in translational science, we have Diana Hamden from KCU. And if we have a student that's not here today for the award ceremony, another student from the school will accept on their behalf. From translational science, second place, we have Bethany Bockelman from UMKC. This is not Bethany. All right, and in the first place for translational science, from UMKC, we have Shekhar Gubnani.
Okay, next up, we're going to be giving out our clinical science awards. In third place, we have Trey Tinich from UMKC. In second place, we have Abjith Jenkins from UMKC. We have Harish coming to accept one of us. And in first place, we have Jake Zevitz from the University of Kansas.
And our last category is quips. In third place from UMKC, Atrika Paul. In second place from KCU, Anusha Himasani. This is not Anusha. And then in first place from KU, Peyton Kavanaugh.
All right, that concludes our conference for today. From the bottom of all our hearts, thank you for coming out today. To our faculty and everyone that mentored us, this would not have been possible without you all today. To all the students that helped put together this conference, again, could not have happened without you. And to all our attendees, we hope to do this again next year, and we hope you will join us. We will send out a survey and email. Please give any feedback, good or bad. We want to hear it all. And thank you again for coming today.